Associate Director with the Children and Families Program at NCSL. You've made it to the end of Base Camp Day 1. During our time together in this last session of the day, we'll explore economic mobility in the United States. To help with this discussion, we're joined by our moderator, Danielle Goonan, Managing Director, Economic Policy Investments and Grantmaking with the Rockefeller Foundation. Our speaker for this session is David Williams, Director of Policy Outreach with Opportunity Insights. Biographies are available on this session page if you'd like to learn more about each speaker. We'll host a discussion later in this session, so please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box throughout this session. With that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Danielle to get us started.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, depending where y'all are located. It is so nice to be with you today, and thank you for sticking with us. I know this has been a long day, and we are a year and a half, or almost a year and a half into Zoom conferences that seem to never end. As Heather said, my name is Danielle Goonan. I lead the Rockefeller Foundation's Economic Policy Unit on our Equity and Economic Opportunity team. The mission of our organization and what we believe in is that every person in the United States who works should be able to meet the basic needs of their family and have a path to a better future. So I'm extremely excited for the conversation today because it aligns directly with the work that I and my team do at the Rockefeller Foundation. A big part of how we act on that belief is by making investments that advance the economic stability of workers in the US, particularly those who are undervalued and underpaid. And unfortunately, that group is disproportionately people of color and women. And to that end, we do believe that government policy is a key tool, and in many ways, potentially the key tool to improve worker stability that can also work to close racial and gender equity gaps. And we support this work nationally and in specific states. So if y'all are interested in some of our state work, happy to chat with you at a different time about it. I'm excited to be joined today by our expert, David Williams. He's the Director of Policy Outreach at Opportunity Insights, and he's going to help us better understand the decline of economic mobility in the United States, including the impacts of racial disparities, its intersection with multiple policy issues, and the challenges for children and families. By the end of this session, we do hope that you will understand the potential evidence-based policy solutions that exist to address declining economic mobility. Okay, so why are we here? Over the last decade, there seems to be a veneer of a strong economy, yet conditions have actually gotten worse for millions of families across the United States. And that decline set the stage for the dual health and economic crises of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since 1948, we know that productivity has increased by 248%, but median hourly compensation has increased by only 129%. Even before COVID, household economic insecurity was on the rise, with living costs rising faster than wages. And COVID only deepened that insecurity, with a stark jump in adults doing worse off financially. So David, I'm going to turn it over to you to walk us through Opportunity Insights' robust evidence-based research on this topic. Thanks for being here.
Danielle, thank you so much for that intro, and Heather, thank you and NCSL for having us. Very excited to be here. You know, I think I'm in the unenviable position of being at the end of a full day of Zoom calls, so I'm going to make talking about data hopefully as interesting as possible. But I think Danielle really teed up a lot of these issues well. And right, my goal is to talk a bit about our work at Opportunity Insights. We're a research and policy institute based at Harvard. So we'll talk a little bit about that research, how it impacts or might be relevant to a lot of the work you're doing in your states on the policy level, then thinking around how we can use research data in all these different policy areas that we're discussing and debating right now to think about how to respond to the current crisis to really hopefully help our communities build back and build back better. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Hopefully this works. So hopefully you're looking at my screen now. Again, David Williams, Opportunity Insights. First, I want to start with a little bit about how we use data. In some ways, it can help clarify the actual questions we're asking, right? When we're thinking about all these different policies, all this different research where we have good information around policy impacts, right? First, what's the actual question that we're trying to ask and answer? And one thing that we think about at Opportunity Insights is the idea of the American dream. The concept that if you work hard, you'll be able to rise up the income ladder, no matter where you started. And something we can do is actually use historic IRS records to better understand these trends. So specifically, we can ask the question of, if you're a child who's born in a low-income family, basically in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, what are the chances that you'll grow up to become a high-income adult, that you'll grow up to be in the top 20% of wage earners in the country? And what we see using this IRS data is that that chance for a kid in the US is 7.5%. Now, is that good? Is that bad? What we can do is we can compare it to other countries. So in the UK, that chance is actually 9%. In Denmark, Canada, and Sweden, upwards of 12, 13, 15%, much higher rates of this metric of upward mobility. So in a certain sense, the American dream, right, the ethos at the core of what we think about as our culture of this land of opportunity, of upward mobility, is actually in some sense much more alive just across the border in Canada. Something we've also seen using these same types of data is that, right, this idea of the American dream, the idea of guaranteed prosperity, has been fading dramatically over the past 50 years. If you can see on this chart, we're looking at the chance that the child grows up to earn more than their parents in terms of household income. And we see that for people who were born in the 1940s, that metric of upward mobility was almost a guarantee. Over 90% of individuals born in the 1940s grew up to earn more than their parents, to rise up the income ladder. But that guarantee of prosperity, of upward mobility, has more or less become a coin flip. Folks who are in the workforce today, those who were born in the 1980s, basically have a 50-50 shot of growing up to earn more than their parents. And in many ways, we think that's at the core of a lot of the cultural and political frustration that we see today throughout our communities. And it's really our goal to try and use data to better understand these trends and to think through policies and solutions that can help us reverse the trends that we see in the data. For a bit of context, my role at Opportunity Insights is really about helping make sure that people are aware of the research and that we're able to use it to support the work happening on the ground in our communities, but also really listening and understanding what the needs are from policymakers and practitioners, and hopefully informing our research agenda to be more effective and as helpful as possible. But also, before Opportunity Insights, I served in the mayor's office in Detroit. And I entered when we were entering into the biggest municipal bankruptcy in US history, right? So Detroit's a city that has lost over half of its population, over 1 million people since 1950s. But even in the last 15 years, 1 in 3 homes was lost to tax foreclosure. So it's a city that, especially at the time, we were focused on literally rebuilding the physical infrastructure of the city. You know, it was an emergency moment, but I think it really helped us galvanize across the public and private sector. And I think nationally, we're at a very similar moment as we're trying to pull ourselves out of this pandemic and this crisis. And in Detroit, right, we really started to see progress. We were getting rid of blighted homes, helping support and revitalize neighborhoods. New investments and companies were coming back into the city. We saw real progress. But something that was a core question for my colleagues and myself was, as we're seeing development in our neighborhoods, are the most vulnerable families, those who've been with us for decades, who struggled through the bad times, are they really benefiting from the changes we're seeing in our communities? Are their life trajectories and those of their children being transformed by the good things happening because of good public policy and coordinated effort? And candidly, we didn't have the data to know exactly what kind of impact we were having on the people behind the policies. And so that's why at Opportunity Insights, it's our goal to use our specific and unique research and data to help ask and answer these questions at a national level. So it's kind of our specialty to use big data and these data sets we have to study how to increase upward mobility. And we analyze a broad range of interventions. It's not just about housing or college access or healthcare, but how do all these things come together to really increase economic opportunity? And the starting point for our research is the sharp differences in rates of opportunity across different geographies. So something we've done, it's called the Opportunity Atlas. It's actually available online at opportunityatlas.org, is a tool that measures economic mobility. And what we do is that we use historic IRS and Census Bureau data to track the outcomes of 20 million kids who are growing up in the 1990s across the country. We're able to pinpoint those kids who are growing up in lower income families. We know where they were growing up, and we can track their outcomes and their earnings into adulthood. And by using that data, we can make an average for every census tract and every neighborhood in the country to really get a better sense of the geography of opportunity. And when we do that research, right, we see the opportunity does vary dramatically based on where you grow up. This map is looking at every region in the country. And what we see is that these areas of dark blue in the Great Plains, in places like Iowa, Minnesota, and Nebraska, and on the coast, places like New York and the Bay Area in California, we see very high rates of upward mobility. Places where for kids growing up in low-income families, they earn on average upwards of $30, $35, $40, sometimes over $45,000, higher rates of opportunity of upward mobility than any country that we have data for. But you see these areas of dark red, places in the Rust Belt like Detroit and Cleveland, places like Charlotte and Atlanta, where on average, if you grow up in a low-income family, you're more or less destined to remain a low-income adult. So we see these trends. So what's behind these disparate outcomes that we see across the country? You know, one thing we can do is look at other factors and see if they're associated with these rates of upward mobility. So something we do is look at more traditional metrics of prosperity. So something like job growth, and we compare that to our metric of upward mobility. And something we see is the job growth rate from the past 20 years is actually not very associated with our measure of opportunity. And for example, places like Charlotte and Atlanta, communities that have been growing tremendously for the past 20 years, right? New jobs are flowing into these areas. On the surface, very prosperous places. But it seems like the kids who grow up there, especially kids in low and middle income families, aren't able to tap into all the resources within those communities. So in a place like Charlotte, where you have Wells Fargo and Bank of America, lots of really great jobs coming to that community, oftentimes people are moving to Charlotte to take those jobs. And those kids who grow up just a few miles away aren't able to rise up the income ladder and be part of all the prosperity taking place in Charlotte. So that's why we really focus on human capital development. Right? How can we support children and families to be able to tap into these opportunity structures and be able to take advantage of all the things that exist within their own communities? Another factor is race and ethnic identity. And because we can tie the IRIS data to Census Bureau data, we can break down these different outcomes by things like race, gender, and other factors. And something we see is that race is a very big driver of opportunity for almost every community in the country. So this map here is looking at that same metric of upward mobility, but it's looking specifically at outcomes for Black men compared to those of white men. And it's important to note that both of these maps are on the same color scale. So what that means is that the best places in terms of outcomes for Black men growing up in low-income families are still worse than the worst places for white men. And we see that in almost every community across the country. Black and white men who grow up in the same region, in the same cities, even in the same neighborhoods, still have very different outcomes. And I think that forces us to think critically around those systems and those processes and those characteristics of communities that are really, in some sense, holding Black men back, whether it's discipline in schools, employment discrimination in the job market, or the criminal justice system. Right? What are ways that our different policies and structures are impacting different groups in different ways? And I think should always be top of mind as we're thinking about policy solutions moving forward, but how we make sure they're targeted to really impact in beneficial ways the communities who need support the most. And one of the other takeaways, and it's also available online at the Opportunity Atlas, is the same range of outcomes that we see across the country, we also see within communities as well. So that same range of red to blue that we see from places like Charlotte to a place like Dubuque, Iowa, we can see within a city like New York. Right? You have parts of Queens and Lower Manhattan, these areas of deep blue, very high rates of upward mobility, but places like East Harlem and the Bronx and parts of Brooklyn where we see these deep reds, again, much lower rates of mobility. But because of this geographic proximity, I think it helps us think a bit more clearly around, right, opportunity can exist just a few miles away. So what are the differences within our communities that are really driving these outcomes? And so two of the takeaways that we have based on this research are, one, right, how do we invest in communities, in neighborhoods to help support families there to make them higher opportunity places? And then how do we also increase access to some of these places that historically have had higher outcomes for the kids who grow up there? So one, we'll think about that place-based piece. So first, using our research and data, we can think about what are the characteristics of these places that have higher rates of upward mobility. So one place that have lower poverty rates, places where we have more socioeconomic integration, are places where we see higher rates of upward mobility. Places that have high quality schools, schools that support students from low income backgrounds. But also one factor that we see is most highly correlated with upward mobility is stable family structure. So communities that have a higher proportion of two-parent households have higher rates of upward mobility. And one fact that I found really staggering was that in communities that have more Black fathers specifically, all the young Black men in that community, regardless of their own family circumstances, have higher rates of upward mobility. I think it really speaks to seeing people you can relate to that live around you, who model pathways to college and to career, really has a tangible impact on kids' long-term outcomes. Additionally, social capital, places that have high levels of neighborhood cohesion, places where we see relationships forming across lines of race and class, are places that have high upward mobility rates. So environment matters, the people around you matters, the relationships you're able to build are things that we can literally track outcomes for 10 and 15 years later. And how does that translate into policies and programmatic work? Well, there's lots of great programs out there that have demonstrated their ability to really change kids' trajectories. So a program like Year Up, a workforce development program that provides holistic support for kids who are disengaged from the workforce and puts them on a track to have much more stable careers. And by actually testing these types of programs, we can see which ones have those long-term impacts. So that's what a lot of what we do is trying to understand what kind of programs work, but I think also especially important, and I think it's relevant to policy conversations we're having today, how do we make sure that kids have access to these supports, especially in neighborhoods where we have lower rates of upward mobility? So whether it's early childhood supports, high dosage tutoring in schools, mentorship programs, college access programs, or workforce development programs like Year Up, how do we in communities make sure that those kids and families who need this support are reaching it? So you have programs like purpose-built communities that help build mixed income communities. The Harlem Children's Zone in New York, which provides a net of social and supportive services to their families. And groups like Strive Together that demonstrate a collective impact model to support communities holistically. Right? How can we learn from these different types of approaches in leveraging evidence-based and research-informed practices, but making sure that kids and families receive access to them within their communities? Then number two, again, that idea of reducing segregation, deconcentrating poverty, and increasing access to areas that traditionally have been higher opportunity. And so I'll mention here some work that we've done in the community in Charlotte. A few years ago, our research found that of the 50 biggest metro areas in the country, Charlotte actually had the lowest rates of upward mobility of all of them. And that came as a surprise, right? We saw on those earlier slides, right? Charlotte is a place known for being high growth. Lots of jobs are coming to the community. But this data helped reveal that despite what was happening on the surface, right, low and middle income kids really weren't being able to take advantage of all those opportunities. But what we found very heartening was that, right, Charlotte saw this data, but didn't become defensive, right? Community leaders said, hey, there's a lot of great things happening here, but how can we become a community of opportunity for all and not just the few? So they came together, the philanthropic sector, corporate sector, nonprofits, and government, and created what they called the League on Opportunity Task Force, which really dove deep to study what were the obstacles communities, people in the community were facing as they were trying to rise up the income ladder. And one factor they found was segregation and looking deep into their history. And like many communities, right, where people live today in Charlotte is not an accident. histories of residential segregation, redlining, discrimination in the housing market have shaped what Charlotte looks like today, and in large part determines who lives where and which places of Charlotte are more affluent and which places are higher poverty. And we see that history is reflected in the outcomes we're able to measure in our data today. And something that we see in Charlotte and across the country is affordable housing resources. Things like housing choice vouchers or low-income housing tax credit developments are extremely important resources for millions of people and families across the country. But families who have access and use these resources are oftentimes concentrated in high poverty neighborhoods with lower outcomes for the kids who grow up there. And oftentimes, families using resources like the housing choice voucher are actually more likely to live in higher poverty areas than families who are similarly low income but aren't using those vouchers. So in some ways, despite being such an important resource, these tools sometimes are actually exacerbating the same form of concentration of poverty, the same forms of segregation that in many ways drive these bad outcomes in some of these places that we see today. So while we must be, of course, investing in affordable housing, how do we really leverage housing and housing policy to serve as a springboard to opportunity? And so through much of this research, we talk with a wide range of stakeholders, but specifically some of the housing authorities in Washington state said, hey, we see this data. It affirms a lot of what we know about our local communities. And we would love to test out, right, how can we increase access for our families who are using these rental subsidies, these housing choice vouchers, especially in places that historically have been very hard for low-income families and families of color to access. So with the Seattle and King County Housing Authorities, we piloted a project called Creating Moves to Opportunity. And it was a randomized trial, a scientific evaluation to try and develop policy strategies that reduce barriers these families using housing choice vouchers face in the rental market, especially if they're trying to move to some of these higher opportunity areas in Seattle and King County. So what did that look like? So one, we provided customized search assistance, basically providing housing coaches, housing counselors to help families during the rental process. We also engaged with landlords, many folks who may not have been aware of the housing choice voucher program or were a bit skeptical of dealing with housing authorities or some of the families involved in the program, and also provided short-term financial assistance with things like moving expenses, security deposits, and the like. And what we saw is that historically, and in this evaluation, families that didn't receive these supports, under 15% ended up moving to these higher opportunity areas. Whereas families who did receive support during this program were almost 4 times more likely to move to these higher opportunity areas. And our research demonstrates that kids who grow up in these places will on average earn upwards of $150,000 or $200,000 more over their lifetimes. So this fairly simple intervention, already leveraging a federal program that we have in existence today, has the potential to really change and transform life outcomes and start to deconcentrate poverty and roll back those histories of segregation that have in many ways defined our communities and a lot of these lower outcomes that we're seeing throughout neighborhoods. And what we find exciting is that this demonstration, along with the great work of many housing authorities, has helped push the policy conversation in Washington, D.C. as well. So in 2019, the Housing Choice Voucher Mobility Demonstration Act was passed. And earlier this year, 10 demonstration sites were chosen to fund and test more interventions like Creating Moves to Opportunity and to hopefully scale successful programs like it. And I'm a housing lawyer by background, so this field is very interesting to me, but there's so much great momentum now, both at the local, state, and federal level, about a range of interventions focused on increasing affordable housing, but specifically increasing broader access for families, especially the most vulnerable. And I think especially because we have this great data and research that demonstrates how impactful these kind of interventions can be, I'm very excited to see how both local, state, and federal policymakers can work together to bring all these suites of policies together to really increase access and create integrated communities that can truly serve as springboards of economic opportunity. And so, of course, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about COVID, right? So we talked a bit about the research, how that can be relevant to a couple of policy areas. But what are the implications of COVID, and what does the data really tell us about how it's impacting our economies and subsequently our communities? So something we've seen leveraging private sector data is that, of course, the pandemic impacted everyone. But when we actually break down our data into subgroups, it tells a very important story. So we were able to track change in employment rates across the country, but based on wage types for different jobs. So what we see on this chart is that everyone was hit when the pandemic hit. We saw job loss across the board, but especially for lower income workers. But after a few months, in a certain sense, the economic impact of the pandemic, recovered for many, especially higher wage workers, right? Basically back by July of 2020, higher wage and middle wage workers, employment rates actually came pretty back up to pre-pandemic levels for that demographic. But even to this day, employment rates are still down by over 20, almost 25% for lower wage workers. So as we continue to hopefully recover, it's really important to break out our data to see who's being impacted by the pandemic and if these jobs are really coming back, so we can target our resources to those who are still struggling, even a year, even 18 months after the pandemic hit. Similarly, looking at education and using data from an online curriculum called Zearn, we see a similar pattern in terms of learning loss and engagement in school. We saw significant drop-offs for everyone in terms of progress made on some of these online learning platforms early on during the pandemic, but we saw a very significant recovery shortly thereafter. And even to today, progress on these platforms is still down by 20% in lower income communities. And this has real long-term impacts, right? There's just not the immediate impacts of job loss, but these children who are already in disadvantaged schools and disadvantaged communities, they're continuing to fall even further behind. And we know from our research that that will have deep ramifications for years, if not decades, moving forward. So I mentioned my time in Detroit, and I do think that there are some really interesting similarities. I think our data shows that without really investing in those most vulnerable, COVID is only going to exacerbate many of the unfortunate trends that we see in our data. But this is a real moment where I think we have the opportunity to face these sometimes harrowing data points and think about how we can truly invest in smart ways, in evidence-based ways, in ways that we know can have impact, and in ways that we know can change these trends that we saw before COVID and that we know are continuing through the pandemic. And part of what's important is that we often think about these issues from an equity standpoint. But these issues are also at the core of our economic growth and success as a country. And so some research from a few years back, we actually looked at patent rates of children across the country. And something we see is that kids are much more likely to become inventors and innovators if they had high third grade math test scores. But that's only the case if they come from high income families. So in many ways, many of the disparities we see in terms of neighborhoods, in terms of resources, are actually holding back an entire generation of people who could be innovating and inventing in the future and helping us deal with future anomalies like the pandemic, future recessions, could be the leaders who keep our country vibrant and moving forward. But they're not able to because of these disparities that we see in the data, that even those kids who have the most potential, they're still being held back because of the circumstances of their birth. And in our data, we see that if women, minorities, and children from lower income families, if they were to invent at the same rate as men from higher income families, the innovation rate in America would quadruple. So it really should be a national imperative, not just for issues of equity, but again, to help us tap into the potential that we have as a country, that we have within our young people to help guide us into the future. And one point that I'll end on is a new initiative we're working on called Policy Impacts. And it's research that looks at how we can more effectively measure cost effectiveness of a range of different policies. So a lot of our Opportunity Insights research looks at the impacts of these policies. How do we make sure that we're really getting the bang for the buck when we're investing at the local, the state, and the federal level? And a lot of our research points to how making investments in kids throughout youth really pays off. I think I already talked about how the right investments can have long-term impacts on these children themselves. Talked about how it can really help spur our economy, help us become a stronger nation in general. But also, many of these investments just make sense financially, right? Whether it's investing in early education or college access programs, right? Those types of policies that invest in human capital, that help kids reach their potential and go on to become successful adults, right? Those same kids, because they're earning more and paying more in taxes, oftentimes the money we recoup from their success is actually more than we invested in the first place, right? These types of programs, these types of policies, they literally pay for themselves. They're not just the right thing to do or the equitable thing to do. They're not just the best thing to do in terms of our development, our economic development, our capacity for innovation as a country, but they also just make dollars and cents. So I think as we're living in this moment, thinking about how we recover and hopefully build back better, I think we want to be a resource to help people think about what are those policies, what are those programs that can have impact, and how do we use research, data, and evidence-based practices to build the political will to make those investments that can help us recover from COVID and move forward in a direction that we can all be proud of. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy to share more about our research, but I would love to hear from you all. And I know Danielle and I will be talking and kind of discussing this research. And I think thinking about how we can apply this kind of work to all of our daily work, especially in this most critical time. Thank you.
Thank you, David, so much. That was a wonderful taste of the incredible research that you all do over at Opportunity Insights. And I'm excited to get a bit deeper into the data, but also start talking a bit about how this ultimately can and should impact policy. And given our audience today, policy, I would think at the state level would be the predominant focus, but also how states should be using ARPA money and any potential other COVID money that's coming down. You know, there's an infrastructure bill at the federal level that is hopefully this close to getting through. We also have reconciliation coming up soon. So we'll have some of that conversation a little later on, but we do have some questions about the data. And I think it's important to answer any and all questions about the data before we move into the policy conversation. So our first question is from Justin Garassi in California. And he asks, how is social capital quantified?
That's a really great question. I think it's a difficult one also. So you have the work of Robert Putnam, and he created his social capital indices, which looks at a range of factors in communities. We also, for the time being, use things like Census Bureau return rates and voting records in place to see, places that have more and higher levels of civic engagement. But we're also doing more research on that front, because I think those are, of course, all imperfect proxies for social capital. And I think we're trying to really tease and test out, right, what forms of relationships, what forms of social capital can really drive better outcomes, right? Is it places that have more civic organizations? Is it places where we specifically see what some people term bridging social capital, right? Places where we see more relationships across lines of race and class. And so we're doing more research on that front to be able to dive deeper into those issues. But for the time being, we use different proxies like Robert Putnam's work, like using data from the Census Bureau and from voting records.
Thank you, super helpful. We have another question. It comes in from anonymous, but again, I think it's important to answer this question and any and all questions around data. And I think you hinted to this answer, but maybe we need just a more direct answer from you, which I think would be important for this crew. So the question is, as we look at the map of Black versus white, I would be I would also be interested in knowing the education difference and whether the families have a single parent or two parents involved. So, in another way to ask, when you solve for number of parents, when you solve for education, are you still seeing racial disparities?
Yeah, great question. And I'll take one step back too. So I showed that chart that looked at the outcomes for Black men compared to white men. And so, of course, in that respect, we're kind of not solving for, right? These are men growing up in similarly lower middle income families, right? So it's not about the starting point, but for Black and white men growing up in similarly lower income families, we're seeing very different outcomes. Interestingly, we actually see in some sense similar outcomes for Black women compared to white women. So when you control for household income, we see very similar individual wages for Black women compared to white women. And we do control for family structure, two-parent households, those different factors. And we again see those disparate outcomes for men, but not so much for women. And I think that part of it especially to make us think, hey, this is about these structural issues that I think many of us are aware of. Again, employment discrimination, discipline in schools, criminal justice system issues. So I think being able to break it down by those different subgroups while controlling for those other factors, I think helps pinpoint what might be driving these outcomes.
Got it. Perfect. And then the last question I have for on data is my own question. We live in a time where, right, people question data a lot. People don't know where to get their sources from. There's any and all amount of data out there that can confirm whatever it is you may or may not want to believe. So why should folks be looking to your data and the data of Opportunity Insights as they think about what needs to be fixed, what works well, what doesn't work well, and ultimately what policies need to be implemented?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think something that we all struggle with. I think, our goal is to provide as easily accessible information and data as we possibly can. So one, I'm not sure if this is reassuring or not, but my colleagues are all professors at universities, right? So all their work is peer reviewed, goes through these crazy processes that go above my head. But also, when you have tools like the Opportunity Atlas, we make all that data publicly available, right? So all the maps I created, that data is available for every neighborhood, every census tract, every state across the country. So you can go to the website, opportunityatlas.org right now. You can zoom into your own community, but you can also literally download the underlying data and do your own analysis. And that's for all of our work. Similarly, with some of the data on the impacts of COVID, we have it available at tracktherecovery.org. So you can see these different charts I created and create one for your own state, but you can also download that data and do your own analysis as well. We know that these are complicated issues, and I think we all have very different opinions on what the best policy should be. So I think our goal is to really create, objective research and data tools that people can then use to empower their work based on whatever their preconceived notions are. If you can't download the data on your own, you might have to trust us or find someone who you really trust to download it for you, and they can say whether or not what we're doing is legit.
I appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to skip to a question that I would say, in the philanthropic space, we call narrative, right? And we know how important narrative is to affect policy change. So the question is from Juan Napolis in Nashville. He asks, how does your organization propose that we combat that self-interest that prevents mixed income neighborhoods from coming to fruition and leads to racial and generational gaps in homeownership? So you said you were a housing lawyer. I know you worked in Detroit. I'm sure you saw some of this. But in general, do you have any advice for our group on the call today in terms of how we get past some of, the self-interest that exists and the different priorities that different constituent groups have?
Yeah, that's a good one. I could talk about that for a very long time, but it's interesting because, in some ways it's not, I think the self-interest piece is huge. We're all self-interested. There's really no way around that. But I think interestingly, this issue specifically is also difficult across the partisan spectrum, right? So I think, you have the stereotypical kind of NIMBY conversation, not in my backyard, right? Maybe more affluent communities saying, we don't want new affordable housing or low-income housing because that will bring down property values. But interestingly, you also have a dynamic in, let's say, lower income communities where if they see new investments happening, there might be that concern that, hey, these new investments aren't for us. You say this is going to be a more mixed income community, but actually we just think we're going to be pushed out and not get to take advantage of these things happening within our community. So I think that's makes it more difficult, but it's almost heartening in that like we're all mad about something, right? In some ways, it almost creates opportunities to kind of create alliances across party lines. So, I think the example of creating moves to opportunity is one that I find heartening because it's one where it can kind of bypass some of the heated conversations that we have around, building new affordable housing, right? I think oftentimes because of zoning rules or different regulations in communities, it can actually be very easy to block new developments. However, creating moves to opportunity, right? It's about people leasing out their properties already. And I think something we saw is that if there is discrimination in the housing market, which we know there very much is, actually engaging with landlords on a one-to-one level, actually providing support directly to families using housing choice vouchers seems to actually help families find opportunities in these places. So I think there are bigger structural changes we need, right? There's a lot of work at HUD right now on different initiatives that kind of, basically working to help break down some of these barriers. I think there can be, laws at the state level about non-discrimination against families using vouchers. I think there's a broad range of policies we can work on. Actually, in Charlotte, they're doing a master plan for the entire city, which is thinking about reforming their zoning code to actually increase housing density, some of these higher opportunity areas. These are controversial topics, but I think there are also things we can do right now, like creating moves to opportunity, as we're working on this broader range of policies that I think can help, again, break down these barriers that we've historically seen within our communities.
Okay, so going into policy, when you showed that slide, that the blue versus red, so areas where we're seeing high economic mobility, areas where we're seeing low economic mobility, there was a range, right? So you said high economic mobility in some places in the Midwest, in New York and San Francisco. These are very different places, right? Can you help us understand, are they doing the same things? Are they doing different things that are more appropriated or adapted for their geography? Like, what is it about places that are just so different that we wouldn't even necessarily group together, but they're having positive outcomes?
Yeah, no, great question. I think something that we don't totally have the answer to. I think part of why we try and create a tool like the Atlas to say, hey, this data gives us some really interesting trends, both nationally and locally. But hey, you working in X state or X county or X city, we'd love to hear from you to get your sense of what's going on that's really causing these different outcomes. But I think maybe a couple points that I find interesting. So one is that I think we often talk about, rural versus urban, and maybe one's better than the other. But something we see actually is that within rural areas, we see very different outcomes based on geography as well, right? So you see, again, places like Iowa, Minnesota, those rural areas have some of the highest rates of upward mobility in the country. Whereas rural areas in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, extremely low rates of upward mobility, right? So it's not just about urban versus rural, but the specifics of that geography and of that place. And I think, right, those are places where you look at the history of those communities, right? Like oftentimes in the Midwest, right, investments were made to help, kind of farmers start out and like be able to kind of take advantage of the land there versus in some of these southern states, right? Histories of slavery and Jim Crow where, lower income, middle income families were not kind of given the same opportunities. And I think what's interesting too is that there's obviously that racial dynamic there, but in a place like North Carolina, we see lower outcomes for all low income kids, both Black and white, right? So I think, maybe like those structures that are somewhat historically based on histories of slavery and racial discrimination, actually impacting all of those lower and middle income families as well. So whether it's, again, what the policing culture in a community looks like, what the social safety net is, right? I think those underlying policies, I think in many ways kind of set the tone and drive a lot of these outcomes that we see across the country. But I do think an important point is that, you see those, huge geographic variances across the country. But again, within almost every community in the country, we see that same range of outcomes, right? So it's not just about New York versus California or Midwest versus South, but all communities have areas of higher opportunity and low opportunity. And oftentimes that does come down to these patterns of segregation that we see in the housing market as well.
Got it. Thank you. So we have a group of state legislators and their staffers on the line. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask how state level policy impacts economic mobility, and any thoughts you have for potential short or long-term opportunities that state legislators might want to consider to support economic mobility.
Yeah, so the state plays a huge role. And I think a lot of times what I try and think critically about is where the different policy levels sit, both across the local, across the state, and the federal levels, and how we can actually come together to leverage those all together. But the state alone, of course, is very influential. And I think specifically those spaces and those dollars associated with investments in human capital are obviously a very big deal. And I think especially in the context of COVID, when we're seeing learning loss and when we're seeing it specifically in lower income communities, I think really thinking critically around targeting those families and those kids who need support the most. Right, again, I think it was very striking that when the pandemic hit, we saw a drop in all levels of student progress and student engagement across income levels. But actually in higher income communities, we actually saw an uptick in engagement, I think, once people got used to the new status quo, right? So families who were able, who had laptops at home, oftentimes parents who were probably working at home who were able to then support their kids more actively versus lower income families who many may have been essential workers who weren't at home. There might be spotty internet access or other issues they're dealing with, right? Those higher income families, in some ways, actually almost seem more engaged in the classroom versus lower income families where we're seeing real significant levels of learning loss. So I think thinking critically around when we're spending those education dollars, when we're thinking around education initiatives, making sure that we're focusing on those families who are struggling, who are dealing with learning loss, and how to make sure those resources actually get to them. And I think just the other point on the housing front, eviction moratorium going away, I think we're going to see a lot of disruption in the housing market, making sure that the actual dollars in place are getting to those families who need them. But then in the long term, making sure that we're thinking about how we actually integrate our communities, right? Making sure we deal with the immediate emergency, get families the support they need. Again, we'll see it in the eviction data, we see it in the job loss data, but then how do we make those long-term investments to make sure that we're not only thinking about the next 3 months, the next 6 months, but our neighborhoods, where kids are growing up, making sure they're really in diverse places that can support them in the long run beyond this emergency moment.
And as states are thinking about how to spend that ARPA money, do you have any suggestions on best uses, especially in terms of economic mobility outcomes?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I think we all have a lot of different definitions of economic mobility. I think our bottom line is, one, just investing in youth really pays off. It doesn't always fit the political cycle, right? I think when you're investing in kindergarten, if you're a mayor or a governor or a state legislator, you might not be in office in 20 years when that kid's doing much better because of that investment. But we hope that the research that shows that impact can help make the case for those kind of investments. So I think, when we're thinking about immediate job loss is very important. Helping sustain families through these very hard times is extremely important. But let's make sure we keep investing in those human capital supports for kids, right? Because I think sometimes we might not see them struggling in the data like we see in the eviction data, like we see in the employment data. But learning loss, less resources for kids, we're going to see that in the data in 15, 20 years in really dramatic ways, for better or worse, depending on how we invest today.
Well, talking about human capital, we do have a question here from Adrian Moore, who's in Florida, and this is about the human capital, but focused specifically on adults. Asked, on some of the economic mobility and job recovery dynamics you look at, are those with more competition for their jobs / skills less mobile / slower to recover compared to those with less common skill sets? Does your data show you anything on that?
That's interesting. So we do break down our data a bit based on industry. It's actually a very good question. I don't know if we broke it down specifically looking at that metric. I think broadly what we've seen is that, right, those folks who can work from home, white collar professionals, office workers, professional services, again, we saw a dip when the pandemic hit, but those employment rates are basically back to where they were pre-pandemic. Plus, a lot of these families are saving. I think a lot of the work, especially that in-person work, I think companies are now thinking about what can be automated, what can't be automated. I think, right, we're not seeing that same recovery for those type of jobs. So it's an interesting question of, is it the competition versus the skill level? I think the overall takeaway is these lower wage workers are the ones who are really struggling. But I think that's a great question that I'd love to actually dive more into as well.
Thank you. And then we have a question specific to a specific housing program. So Bakara asks, any thoughts on the Evanston, Illinois housing program, which compensates Black descendants of American slavery with a housing allowance? Can this program be successfully scaled nationally?
That's a great question. Can it be scaled? I have no idea. Sounds very promising and interesting. So I think my sense would be, it's interesting because I think there's the historic precedent, right? There's what we know about racial discrimination in the housing market and trying to compensate for that. But I think interestingly, right, a lot of the trends we're seeing today, they're not just based on history, they're things happening in the market today, right? There's been a lot of great research on Black and white families getting very different appraisals for their homes, right? We see very active discrimination in the housing market for families who are using vouchers, especially for Black families who are using vouchers. So I think there's a really interesting conversation right now about kind of cash transfers and cash support for families and what that can do to promote upward mobility. And I think those are programs that I'd love to see more of, and let's actually evaluate them and test them out and see what kind of impact they do have. But I think we also need to think about, if you give a family a check for X amount, how do you also support them given the factors we know they're impacting their housing search, be it home ownership or rental in the market today? So I'd love to see more of those things. Let's actually test it out. But also, what are those other supports that can help families through these different processes where we know that race and discrimination, racial bias can be factors as well?
And I think that's a great point. So at the Rockefeller Foundation, our first policy out the gate, once we redid our strategy in March 2019, was the earned income tax credit and child tax credit. So we're super excited to see what has happened at the national level. We obviously hope that these expansions are made permanent, but at the state level, we've seen quite a few states from Missouri to Washington State get their first EITCs, to expansions in places like New Jersey, to Illinois, sending unconditional cash to I-10 filers, right? So a whole host of different work is happening. But to your point, we're also supporting work like NELP, National Employment Law Project, having to do with occupational segregation and how we're tracking people into certain jobs. So from a policy perspective, do you see at the state level or at local levels anyone addressing this issue of discrimination, this issue of racism through policy in a really productive, positive way? Or is this something that just still hasn't been done much yet?
That's a really good question. I think to be candid, right, this isn't my area of expertise, in part because I think historically there hasn't been as strong of an evidence base for a lot of these workforce development programs to having long-term impact. But I think especially programs like Work Advance, Year Up, some of these sectoral, really targeted workforce development programs are actually really promising and showing even better results than some of their predecessors. So my sense is that there's work to be done on multiple angles, but I think to the structural issues you mentioned, right? What are those broader systems that we can put in place to kind of help make sure we're not steering certain populations in certain directions, but then also providing that individualized support that really helps people navigate these different systems, both through some of these soft skill training with actual technical support, then really bring in the private sector as well and saying, hey, you have all these requirements for your jobs, but do you actually need that? If we're actually able to provide support to these kinds of young people, they work hard, they're just as capable as their counterparts who went to college, who grew up in more privileged circumstances. And we can prove to you, hey, if you give them a shot and we support them, they actually do very well for you. So I think there's both that systemic work of figuring out what are those policies, how do we really combat discrimination, paired with these really strong supportive programs that can really put kids on the right track. And so I think just as the evidence builds for all these programs, and I think we all become more cognizant of the different systemic factors facing a lot of kids of color, I think if we can bring those pieces together through good policy and programmatic work, I think it's a really exciting space. And I think one that we especially need given some of the trends we see from COVID too.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I appreciate it in there. You peppered in a bunch of different examples. Janelle in Texas asks, are there any specific projects or case studies you could point to which use your data to make programmatic or policy changes? I know you talked about Charlotte and Seattle. Are there other places where you've seen your data used to make policy changes?
Yeah, so I think that's the most concrete example. I think where we see the research informs a pilot program that was informed by a lot of work happening in that space already, but then that pilot program then informs broader policy changes. I think that's probably our best concrete example of that kind of work. But we do work in the higher ed space as well, and kind of looking at both how you can increase access for lower income students to schools that really help push kids up the income ladder, and also pro success, like how you actually support kids in college. And I think, as more research comes out on that front, I think kind of helping shift the conversation around, again, how we really, make our higher ed institutions places that are engines of economic mobility. So I think, I'm obviously biased. I have a passion for housing policy, and I think we have some great examples of making progress there. We're excited to hopefully make more progress in more areas as we move forward.
That's awesome. And Sherwood Goodenough asks, I think, a really important question, and this is probably the right questions for our final question. Data is expensive, and data on social justice issues is so commonly extrapolated from federal resources that are often dated or less granular. How do legislators and legislative staff access good data?
So I think, one, there is investing in it. Right. I think if there are particular needs, if there are particular questions, actually expropriating funds and supporting the research and data needed to answer questions in your context. I think to your point, it can be expensive. It takes effort, but most things that are helpful take effort and are expensive. I think a lot of what we do is we try and use the national data sets we have and make them as accessible as possible. There are a lot of really great state policy organizations and policy labs that I think also partner with local communities and legislatures as well. I know in California, this California Policy Lab, there's several of these across the country. I think oftentimes they are in some sense publicly funded. I think partnerships can be a huge part of the equation. When I worked in the mayor's office in Detroit, a lot of work on internal capacity building, but we also partner with the University of Michigan and a group called Poverty Solutions to leverage their expertise to help us answer some of the questions that we were trying to tackle as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who's been in philanthropy for about 10 years now, what I will say is foundations more and more are supporting this type of work, especially if, quite frankly, we could help make state agency data public. So when I was over at the Walmart Foundation, we partnered with folks at Schmidt Futures and the Lumina Foundation to help state agencies work within the same state across their agencies to make data interoperable, especially on higher ed and workforce issues. So what I would say to you is I understand it's expensive. Gladly, I'm seeing more and more foundations step in. My hope is that on some of this too, we'll see the federal government step in, but when I was working on WEO in the Obama administration, that's the biggest issue we heard from states, which was we need to update our state data systems. Please give us more money. So we have to continue to push there. That's for sure. Okay, well, thank you, David, so much. This was an awesome conversation. I don't see any other questions in the queue. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to you, Heather. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Wow, that was awesome. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation and discussion as much as I did. I'd like to extend my sincere appreciation to Danielle and David for joining us today. I learned